Um, but yeah, so I'll start with just introducing myself, or actually introducing the people that are on the background. So we have Sheila, whose face is here, um, Yuri, whose face is also here, and I just wanted to kind of spotlight them because even though um, three of our faces and Lee, three of our faces will kind of be present this whole time. We've got a nice group of people that have been kind of coordinating to make sure all this comes together. So, and it's going to be running smoothly behind the scenes. Um, so thank you to them. Um, and yeah, just to start, my name is Rico. I'm a first year family medicine resident here in the Bay Area in California. Um, and I've been kind of involved in the war tax resistance community since 2005 um, through through the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee, which Lincoln is heading now, and um, I'll pass it on to Lincoln, who will then pass it on to Howard.
Sure. So, yeah, I've been a war tax resistor going back to 1998 and been involved with the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee starting in 1999. And for the last 5.5 years, I've been the coordinator for that group and put together their newsletter and handle a lot of answering the technical questions. And I'm happy to be here. I'll hand it over to Howard. Oh, he, him pronouns, and I'm in what Milwaukee, located in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, uh, traditionally Potawatomi land.
So I'm Howard Waitskin. I've been a CO and a tax resistor actually since college, so it's about 50 years. And so is my brother and grandfather, who was also a CO. And I've worked as a primary care practitioner and teacher of internal medicine and primary care, mainly for underserved populations. Currently, I'm a so-called distinguished professor emeritus in health sciences and sociology at the University of New Mexico, and an adjunct professor of internal medicine at the University of Illinois. And I found that tax resistance, just to give a little introduction, is fun, safe, and actually transformative. It's also very helpful for mental health, at least for my mental health, given the moral contradiction between being a conscientious objector to war versus paying taxes for war. I'll just stop there.
Okay, cool. So just a little framework for what we're going to be doing. Again, this is the healthcare worker war tax resistance webinar. So going to be kind of covering war tax resistance, but really focusing on what that means from a healthcare worker perspective. Um, and um, yeah, so we're going to be starting out kind of just watching a webinar that's already been pre-recorded that Lincoln put together just as a way to kind of come together and get all on the same page without having given people homework to do to prepare for this. Feel free to kind of tune out if you've already seen it, or and/or put questions in the chat as that's going. We'll be following the questions in the chat, um, and that will last for about half an hour. And then after that's over, we'll have time to kind of do a live, like audible question and answer through this Zoom platform. And also just to kind of highlight that we're, part of a broader community of healthcare workers for Palestine and the Bay Area, and in collaboration with the Do No Harm Coalition, um, Disrupt OT, and of course the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee. So a little bit about our community. There's a bunch of things going on in the text in the chat. I'm not going to be keeping up with it while I'm talking, but please tune in there. Okay. And also to kind of help with the framing, I put together some key points I felt, for me at least, what war tax resistance means in this day and age. And you know, obviously this is kind of focused around the time of what's going on in Palestine and our the attack on Gaza that's been funded by the United States. But this is not a new uh, movement, as you'll learn about in the webinar, in the pre-recorded webinar, and in our discussion. But I also, just in terms of thinking through war tax resistance as healthcare workers, I think it kind of starts with, you know, the oath that we take to do no harm, right? And a large portion of our tax money in the United States goes to funding the military, and the military obviously um, contributes to a lot of the global harm that we see across the world. Um, and I think that this is also, you know, there's been discussions of kind of this idea of moral injury, right? Um, of kind of being forced to take care of populations and provide healthcare to our communities in a context where, you know, we're restricted by the constraints of administrative bureaucracy, and we're having to deal with patients who aren't supported by access to social services and crucial economic safety nets. So in a way, kind of um, in that sense of moral injury, of being forced to pay into a system and into a complex that causes a lot of harm. This is a way of kind of taking back agency and doing our work to the full extent of our commitments. Um, and you know, tax resistance as kind of like a democratic exercise in a political economic system where our elected officials are actively ignoring our calls, our concerns, our demands to represent and uphold our popular desire to de-escalate, defund, and prevent international and domestic war. You know, overwhelmingly, our national population is calling for a ceasefire, um, and our elected officials continue to ignore that. So thinking about war tax resistance is kind of addressing that that failure to uphold democratic principles. And again, you know, tax resistance as addressing the discrepancy between what our leaders tell us that we can afford and what our leaders end up demonstrating to us that they can afford. I'm sure we're all aware that we're currently sending billions to a settler colonial state that is able to provide free healthcare to its citizens and other social services, while in the United States, access to healthcare is extremely limited, particularly for the working class, and not to mention, you know, all the excess funds that Israel is using to fund the destruction and displacement of Palestine. And then the importance of kind of engaging in war tax resistance as a healthcare body. So thinking about what it means to um, resist as a collective, you know, reaching a critical mass where our government has to reckon with the reality that its constituents will no longer tolerate, you know, this sort of financial abuse and deceit around our country's adherence to the principles of taxes for the common social and political and economic well-being of our communities. You know, we are promised that our taxes are are to pay back into our society and to do our social and civic responsibility. And we have more than enough evidence to show that that is not actually the principal function of our tax money. And also, kind of lastly, our tax resistance is saying enough with the tax burden disparities that we as individuals have to tolerate and withstand, while corporate entities, industries, and their owners are devoid from responsibility. And that's a whole other discussion, but really thinking about putting pressure again on our government to be acting in a principled and equitable way. So with that, we can get into a little bit more of the specifics of generally what war tax resistance entails, and thinking again through the connections between what's going to be discussed and our specific duties as healthcare workers.
Greetings, my name is Lincoln Rice. I'm the coordinator for the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee. I've been a war tax resistor since 1998, and I've been the coordinator for NWTRCC since 2018. So this is our introduction to war tax resistance. The theme of this is We Won't Pay: War Tax Resistance and Resisting U.S. Militarism. So some important disclaimers. There definitely are some methods of war tax resistance that are illegal, they're against the law, and there could be consequences for doing so. So if you're practicing a method that's against the law, it's definitely an act of civil disobedience. We'll be going through what the law is, what's usually done in practice, but also realizing that the government could change how it implements these laws or how much it actually puts them into practice. So we're going to be sharing historical experience, realizing that things could change. We're not here to try to figure out how to cheat, fudge, or use gimmicks to avoid taxes. It's again more to let people know what their options are and the risks associated with those options if they practice war tax resistance. I happen to have a bachelor's degree in accounting, so I have a basic understanding of what, of the tax system and bookkeeping and those sorts of things, but I'm not a CPA or a financial advisor or a lawyer, though many of our resources have had input from a legal advisor to make sure we're correctly stating the law in certain instances. But again, we're here to share the decades of experience that war tax resistors have had in practicing war tax resistance. So NWTRCC, which we call our organization for short, the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee, is a coalition of groups and individuals across the United States. We were founded in 1982 to support those refusing to pay taxes for war and violence. So I don't want to spend a lot of time at these intro slides. This is more some background, then we'll go into the methods, myths about war tax resistance, and then actual possible consequences. So as you can see here, the United States spends significantly more on its military than any other country in the world. Even in the United States, within its own budget for collected taxes, the US spends significant amounts of money on past and current military expenses. It usually hovers somewhere between 40 and 50% of the budget. This is put together each year by the War Resisters League, who takes time to look through the president's proposed budget and actually figures out where items belong in said budget. People resist for a number of reasons who are part of our movement. There's obviously the military budget, border militarization, federal prisons, the militarization of police. Here we have a tank that through the 1033 program, the US military gave to the Lakeland, Florida Police Department. There's torture and war crimes, the environment. The US military is the #1 institutional user of gas in the world, though climate agreements like the Paris Accord exempt military emissions from those accords. And then more recently, of course, the invasion of Gaza using US weapons. I'm not going to go through all of these again, but just to highlight a couple instances of war tax resistance. It seems if we have enough information about a society, we can probably find an instance of war tax resistance. So one of the earliest instances of war tax resistance in what we now call the United States goes back to the 17th century when an Algonquin tribe refused to pay taxes for a Dutch fort. More recently, when there was a military coup in Myanmar, otherwise known as Burma, in 2021, millions of people there refused to pay their utility bills as a public utility, and those funds were a great source of income for the military there. So people who resisted those utility bills, many of them had armed soldiers come into their homes demanding payment. So we'll see that the risks for war tax resistance in the United States are not as great as those people are facing in Myanmar. So there can be, depending on how one looks at war tax resistance, you could say, oh, there's lots of flexibility. I can look, based on my goals, risk tolerances, and values. It's not a cookie cutter type of thing. I can really fashion it to what I'm comfortable with for my situation. Others, if they wanted to look at it from the other perspective, could say, this is complicated because I can't just resist taxes like the person I already know who's doing it. So there's a lot of flexibility that can be an advantage, but also means a lot of thought needs to go into this before someone actually chooses a method that they're going to practice. So how do you resist military taxes for war? There's two kind of umbrella methods, which then there are, many variations below that. The illegal method, that civil disobedience, is you refuse to pay some or all of the income taxes you owe and then choose to file or not to file. So this, no matter how much you're refusing, is against the law. The only legal method is to earn less than the taxable income amount. This would be the legal method, just not to owe federal income taxes. So oftentimes that's based on the standard deduction. Standard deduction for a single person in 2024 is $14,600. For a married couple, it's $29,200. Head of household, it's $21,900. Though there could be other deductions or tax credits that could raise that limit and still allow you not to owe any federal income taxes. So if you're an employee and you might notice, well, my taxes are already taken out of my paycheck. There's nothing I can do about it. At the end of the year, I get a refund. So for these, there's the option of what we call W-4 resistance. So you may have a memory that on your first day of work or when you accepted a job offer that you were given a W-4. It's a form created by the IRS, but just meant for you to give to your employer so that they know how much to take out of your paycheck. So I'm not going to go through how to fill it out, but essentially you can fill it out in such a way that either a smaller amount or nothing is taken out of your paycheck. And so we have a website dedicated to this, newtrick.org/W-4. And there we have a video, a flyer, and a short 8-page booklet, depending on what depth of analysis or what style of learning is better for you if you want to practice W-4 resistance. This then gives you the option if you want to pay your taxes or not on April 15th. It could also just be an option that if you currently get a refund, to adjust your W-4 to make it accurate so that you don't owe anything and you're not getting a refund, so that you're just simply not giving the IRS a free loan for the whole year to spend on war and violence. If you're self-employed, the situation works a little bit differently. You don't fill out a W-4, you fill out a W-9. That's if you're working for usually a corporation. If you're like a carpenter doing household work for households, they're not required to report anything, so they wouldn't take any of that information from you. But if you're working for a corporation, they'll do a W-9 where they take your name, address, and social security number at the end of the year using a 1099 NEC, non-employee compensation form. If you made more than $600 or they paid you more than $600 in income, they'll report that to you and to the IRS. In this method, they do not take taxes out for your federal income taxes that are due on April 15th, or for Social Security and Medicare. You're responsible for paying all of those. So again, it's in one sense easier to practice war tax resistance if you're self-employed. It also, depending on what type of self-employed work, it might be more under the table if someone maybe wanted to not file or try to fall through the cracks a bit more. We've also seen the growth of the gig economy, which results in the 1099-K form being filed. That's a form that's basically used anytime there's a third party that's holding income money for you before it's given to you. So that actually could be if you're a small business and you receive payments from Visa, MasterCard, PayPal. Those are all third parties that hold the money temporarily for you. So you'd get a 1099-K. Could also be if you drive for Uber. You're not actually working for Uber. They're just letting you know there's people who want to ride. They'll take the money temporarily from them and then give it to you. So anytime there's a third party involved, it's the 1099-K. Through tax year 2023, you'd only get this form if you had income in excess of $20,000 and more than 200 transactions. For tax year 2024, they're lowering the reporting to simply $5,000. In 2025, if you receive more than $600 in this type of income, it'll be reported. So that's definitely something to be aware of. Filing versus not filing. One, you're more seen and noticed. The other, you're a bit more hidden. So there could be advantages or disadvantages for both, or it could also depend on what your values are. So when we talk about filing, you know that the IRS will at least have an accurate assessment of what you owe, and it allows you to send a letter of protest if you would wish. So briefly going over to not filing, if you don't file and the IRS chooses to file on your behalf, they notice that you should have filed and you're not. When they file on your behalf, they usually overestimate your income. So if at some point you become collectible, they could end up collecting much more than they should have. So even if you're choosing not to file, we always recommend that you fill out your forms and keep all the paperwork on that so that you could dispute it if the IRS files on your behalf and starts collecting from you. Going back to filing, it's much easier for the IRS to start the collection process because before they can collect taxes, they need to assess the tax debt. In order to do that, you need to have filed. So again, you can see where if you don't file, the IRS, they might never get around to filing on your behalf. So you are kind of completing that first step for them. A lot of people who file like to do it because it starts the 10-year statute of limitations. So once they process your tax forms and assess that tax debt, now they have 10 years to either collect the money or if they choose to criminally prosecute you, which is rare, which we'll get into later. But once the 10 years passes, then they can no longer collect the money or criminally prosecute you. There's an exception if you filed forms that were fraudulent, if you underestimate your income or put lower income on purpose or take deductions you shouldn't have. If you're filing a false 1040 form at the end of the year, that's tax fraud. There's no statute of limitations on that. It can also make it easier to apply for scholarships, healthcare insurance subsidies, etc. So to be clear, you don't need to pay your income taxes to qualify for student loans or Obamacare. But for student loans, it's also not required that you file, but they like to verify your income amount by looking at your filed tax forms. And depending on what worker you're working with the student loan people, they may be more or less open to trying to verify your income in other ways. With health insurance subsidies, it's actually required that you file. If you don't file, you'll be kicked off or not be able to get them in the first place. Going to not filing, as we mentioned, it makes IRS collection more difficult because first they need to file on your behalf, and that takes more work on their part, and they are grossly underfunded at the moment. There's no statute of limitations, or at least not until they file on your behalf. Once they file on your behalf, which will assess the amount of tax debt, then the 10-year clock starts. There's also an additional penalty for not filing. So some myths about war tax resistance. I'll go to jail. So very few war tax resistors have gone to jail. Since the end of World War II, only one person's gone to jail simply for not paying their taxes. So to be clear, that's something to be aware of. Simply not paying your federal income taxes is an offense that could land you in prison. But the only war tax resistor who actually faced this since the end of World War II was Tony Serra in 2005. Probably the IRS chose to pick on him because he's an activist lawyer, and part of the prosecution of that law needs to be that the person understood what they were doing, and that's much easier to prove with a lawyer. So I would say there's a heightened risk for lawyers, and they'd want to think more about this than someone who's not a lawyer. Otherwise, especially over the last 25 years, the only people who have done jail time for war tax resistance are those who have filed fraudulent forms. As long as you file accurate forms, at least you could still, they could change their policy, but at the moment they're not criminally prosecuting those who file accurate forms, but they will at times practice different forms of collection, which is not the criminal division of the IRS, but the civil division of the IRS. The IRS will take my home, car, or property. So this is something that wouldn't have been a myth if we were talking about the 70s, 80s, early 90s. It was actually very common during that time for them to particularly take cars. It'd be very common for you to know a war tax resistor friend who had had a car taken. And then you might know, at least maybe not in your inner circle of friends, but you probably have heard of people who had homes taken. That did happen from time to time. But the IRS had a change of practice and strategy starting in the late 90s. So we see this drop. So this is from their own information. We see where they had been taking in excess of 10,000 pieces of property a year. And now since the late 90s, it's anywhere between 50 and 400 pieces of property a year. This seems to be a practice that at the moment they more reserve for the rich who are not paying their taxes for whatever reason. The IRS will just get the money in the end. So this is a graphic from the IRS themselves that shows the gross tax gap. So the gross tax gap is they estimate what they believe is owed to the federal government on a yearly basis minus what is actually paid. So they believe that the gross tax gap, the amount that should be paid that's not every year, is $458 billion, so close to $500 billion. By historical precedent, they believe that at the end of the day, after the statutes of limitation run out or things just become too old to really look into, they'll collect about $52 billion of that. So that's roughly 12 or 13%. So we can see that the majority of unpaid federal income taxes, they never collect. War tax resistors don't pay for things we need. So it's a common practice of those war tax resistors who are refusing to pay some or all of their federal income taxes to redirect those funds to organizations and groups that can use the money. And so we often do that as individuals, but there's also those who do it in larger groups, particularly in the San Francisco Bay Area and in the Boston area. There are what we call alternative funds that'll do kind of group direction. They accept applications from local organizations and groups working on a variety of issues of human need that they redirect funds. So things that they see as underfunded and not prioritized by the federal government. So what are the actual risks? So you could face a Social Security or wage garnishment. When it comes to a wage garnishment or perhaps a levy, if you're working, as a self-employed person, I often refer to these as the reverse lottery. It's not extremely common. I'll hear of a couple folks a year that either as a self-employed person, let's say they're doing work for some newspapers or some sort of corporation, they may receive a levy there, or a wage employee may receive a salary garnishment. So again, it's not common, but it does happen. Social Security garnishments, on the other hand, are very common for those receiving Social Security who owe a tax debt. I think because it's another federal agency, it's just much easier to process that and to get that in action. And so if they begin a Social Security garnishment, they normally take 15% of your Social Security every month. Bank seizures, also very rare, but if they know you have a bank account, either because of reported interest or previously you had paid taxes with a wire transfer from a bank account, then they'll know about it and may eventually get around to seizing bank funds. If you overpaid to your state, they may seize a state refund before you can get that back. Interest and penalties, a good rule of thumb is that no matter what amount you are refusing to resist in a given year, after 10 years, you'll see that amount double. So if you're resisting $100, it'll probably go up to $200. If you're resisting $1,000, it'll go up to about $2,000. So that's just so you know the risks associated if you happen to be collected upon right before the 10-year statute of limitations expired. We already talked about health insurance subsidies and student loans. Notice of a public lien. Once you owe about $20,000, the IRS will send notice of a public lien to your local county courthouse. The practical effect of this is, let's say you owned a home. That's a transaction that if you were selling your home, it would get processed or at some point through the county courthouse, and the bank processing the loan for the buyer would check to see if there's any public liens against you. So in that sense, they'd have an opportunity to collect those funds that are due to them first before you get the rest of the money. In the past, we also saw at the same time, they'd probably send a letter to crediting agencies, which could affect one's credit. But in recent years, they've been still good about the public liens, but they haven't been contacting crediting agencies. But again, that could change. And then there's the possible loss of a passport for debts over $62,000. So if you have what they call a seriously delinquent tax debt, if you currently have a passport, you can use it till it expires, but you won't be able to renew it. Or if you don't have one, you won't be able to receive a new passport. So this number goes up with inflation at $62,000 for 2024. It goes up $1,000 or more every year. But this is a law that went into effect in 2018. It's still uncertain if it's constitutional or not, but thus far it's held up in the lower courts and lower appeal courts. This is something that you may recall at the beginning of the Biden administration. There, as part of a larger bill, there was $80 billion approved for the IRS over 10 years. This would be a major windfall for them that would allow them to get back up to their budgeting and worker levels of about 10 years ago. They still weren't that effective 10 years ago, but at least they sent out a few more wage garnishments and bank levies and those sorts of things. So it helped them improve that a little bit. With some of the compromises between the Republican Congress and President Biden to raise the debt ceiling. We've seen this gutted during the Biden years. So whether they'll end up getting this money or not will largely depend on who's the president and who's in charge of Congress going forward. So lastly, NWTRC has many resources on our website, materials of newsletters that come out every 2 months, blogs, interviews, tax day activities, gatherings, workshops. We also have a counselor list. So in about 35 states, we have folks who are war tax resistors who are volunteering their time and have undergone some additional training to be more aware of the entire landscape of war tax resistance, who are there to be called or emailed, that if you had a question, you could connect with someone locally and they could help you decide, what you're comfortable with and what method you're looking for that works best for you. So there'll be a link to that in the description. So NWTRC, all of our resources are available for free. The only things we charge for are things that we send in the mail to essentially cover shipping and handling and the production of the materials in their paper format. But otherwise, everything that we produce is available for free, and we simply survive on donations. So you can, if you maybe aren't comfortable with war tax resistance but want to support us, feel free to go to our website and click the donate button. We appreciate it. It helps us keep everything up to date and available to folks. Then lastly, this will be available. You'll notice this in the description to this video, but we have our website again, the W4 page, our counselor contact list, link to sign up for our newsletter. And then there's also lastly, the tax penalty fund. So this is a fund, we host their website, but they're a separate group from NWTRC. They're a group of war tax resistors who are essentially a mutual aid society. So they're there that if someone is collected upon, they're one of the unlucky few. They don't reimburse for the amount for the principal on the tax, but for the penalties and interest, which can be, that extra hit that you may have to deal with if you happen to be collected upon. Those penalties and interest, they'll essentially pass the hat and are able to reimburse usually for the entire amount of interest and penalties collected. So they're a resource that are available to us. And even though war tax resistance is a very private decision tailored to what we are comfortable with, we are here to support each other. I think that's what NWTRCC is for, but also the Tax Penalty Fund puts that in a very active format when it comes to even supporting each other financially. So again, thank you for taking the time to watch this video, learn more about war tax resistance, and hopefully these resources can help you make an accurate decision about where you'd like to go from here.
Okay, one thing I just wanted to also reiterate before getting into the Q&A, the verbal Q&A that will be an extension of the written Q&A that we've already started, is just to mention, you know, there are so many ways to engage in war tax resistance. And I think in another video that you'll probably get a link to at some point from NWTRCC, is that there are as many ways to engage in war tax resistance as there are war tax resistors. So anything from including a letter in filing your taxes. Some people have actually paid their taxes like on a coffin that they turned, like a check that they created from a coffin, or and then, you know, a symbolic withholding of like $5 to also, you know, of course, withholding or redirecting any tax that would otherwise, or any money that would otherwise go to the IRS. So, and then also supporting NWTRCC and engaging in mutual aid, and just the principles of what, making sure that we're adhering to the principles of what tax is supposed to function as in a democratic society. Okay, so we definitely got one question that we can start with. And that didn't make it into the Q&A, which is that this person said that they've gotten threats from the IRS about a lien on personal property if I didn't pay the difference between what I owed and the amount that they assessed. So I do think that they still seize personal property if cash is not presented. And maybe Lincoln can.
Sure. So yeah, the IRS, as I noted during the presentation, they love to send automated letters because that's how they get most of the money that's not paid on time. 50% of all past due tax debt is collected just because they send a letter. And the first letter is a letter that essentially says, hey, you didn't pay. After that, you know, probably within 6 months to a year, you'll get another letter that says, if you still haven't paid, and now within 30 days, we may garnish your wages, seize property, levy a bank account, you know, it goes through a whole list of things. That doesn't mean they're actually going to do anything. That's just, again, another automated letter that, and it's required by them for law. If at some point in the future, whether it is in that 30 days or 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, if they want to collect anything through a levy, seizure, anything, they have to initially send that letter. So that letter doesn't actually mean they're going to do anything. It's just something like you hit that mark of still having an open tax debt. So they just send out that letter. Because as you noted, they only threatened you with a property lien. Again, the IRS, as I put in one of the answers to the questions, like they don't share the amounts that set off different actions by them, but other groups have observed and collected at least certain actions that we know of. So we know that once your tax debt reaches about $20,000, they will send a notice of a public lien to your county courthouse, which has the effect that the main thing is it will affect any transaction that gets processed by a county courthouse. So the main thing would be if you're selling a home, the person who might be getting a loan to pay for your home, that bank or the realtor, someone in that process will check with the county. And if they see that there's a lien against you publicly in that county, they'll make sure that the IRS gets the first amount, so to speak, and then you'll get the remainder of that amount. But again, that's not a property seizure. That I would put on, that's a levy. Like that's them collecting cash when they can get it. So I just hope that clears that up a little bit. At this point, I'm not sure if it'd be more helpful to just answer questions that I see in the chat instead of, doesn't necessarily make sense to be typing them. I don't think. But I see there, or sure, Rico, do you have an opinion?
I have a technical difficulty, so I'm going to be working on that.
Okay.
I did want to also just, yeah, we can move to not doing question and answer in the chat. I may pull some questions from what has already been answered into our live discussion, but I can work on that. So Lincoln, if you could address, or Lincoln and Howard, if you guys could address the Q&A text box while I get my tech figured out, that'd be
Sure.
great. Okay.
Definitely. So I see the first question there is, do you have to tell your employer? I would actually, unless you're on very good, close terms with your employer, I wouldn't recommend sharing it with your employer, especially if you've filled out what we call an inflated W-4, so that stuff should be taken out, but nothing is. Your employer may or may not know this, but at least by federal law, if they know that an employee is submitting an inflated W-4, they're supposed to tell the IRS and then, get advice. And it probably would be told by the IRS to adjust your W-4 so that it's actually appropriate. So again, you're really putting your employer in a position if you tell them what you're doing. I mean, especially, I guess, the people who would handle that in human resources or payroll. If you're filing, someone asked, how would you do this if you're filing electronically? I mean, one, you could, if you, people who are doing like TurboTax, I don't use TurboTax, but my understanding is you can have the option to print them up and mail them in. So many war tax resistors mail in paper just because it uses a lot more IRS resources. It also allows people to send letters. But otherwise, if you're filing electronically, I've been told, I don't file electronically, but others who do have told me that there's an option that if you do owe a tax, you can essentially say you'll send in the amount. So you could either send in, if you're just resisting half, or you could send in the rest with a letter or just send in nothing. But there is an option to file without paying because some people prefer not to pay electronically.
Okay, now I'm back. However, I don't see any of the old Q&As. So if there are, I have two questions that I'd like to ask at some point, so we can I do want to make sure to circle back into some healthcare worker specifics before we end. So if there's any Q&As that I missed that are either address that or that seem particularly pertinent, let's go ahead and answer those first, and then we can bounce back to me and I'll ask my questions.
Sure, there's 4 open Q&As right now. The next one is, how do you know the half that you withhold actually doesn't go to the military? Well, they just use the half you give to the military. So that's correct. That'd be the reason that many folks who are like some war tax resistors, again, it depends on what your values are and what you're comfortable with, but the war tax resistors who refuse to pay 100% of their taxes and redirect them to something else, it's because they know half of whatever they send will be used for the military. Another question, I didn't file taxes for 2020 and have already received 2 letters from the Franchise Tax Board of California. I need to talk to someone because I don't understand what to do. I know someone had asked in the chat about state tax resistance, and we don't provide assistance on that. There could be legitimate reasons in different states for resisting. But it's also just every state, I know not every state has income taxes, but of the, I think 30 plus that do, it's different. The risks are different. The laws are different. The tax, like everything's just different. So we'd have to have like 50 or 35 extra websites for every situation. But as I put in my answer for that, also, it's something to be much more cautious about. State, as opposed to the federal IRS, state revenue offices are very well funded and very much more aggressive. You're much more willing to face jail time. I know when I was doing some volunteer work a number of years ago and didn't work for 3 years, and then I refiled again, the federal IRS didn't blink when I started filing and not paying about the 3 years that I never filed and didn't work. But in Wisconsin, I got very threatening letters from the state of Wisconsin, and I needed, in order to rectify it, I needed to send them notarized letters where I stated that I didn't work because I was volunteering, and I needed to give a detailed explanation of why I didn't file and why I didn't owe. Otherwise, they already had put in the letter, like they estimated I owed this much, even though they had no record of my earnings. So again, I only go into a little bit of detail in that example because states are aggressive. So I think you're right to be concerned, and I would talk to someone who's knowledgeable about California state income taxes.
Okay, I'm gonna take a stab here at a question. So as you know, we've got Howard here, who is a war tax resistor, faculty in the College of Medicine, physician, longtime public health activist. And we've linked to a piece that he published in the Counterpunch that you all can read at your own time or on your own time. But I wanted to take a minute to ask Howard if you could kind of let us know 2 or 3 of the main messages that healthcare workers can take away from your article, for those that haven't read it yet.
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. So I really appreciate the invitation to talk today. It's very gratifying to see the folks participating. So the first theme is that, as health workers, we try to do no harm, but actually consenting to war taxes does a lot of harm. And that's a fundamental issue. Also, I just wanted to argue, as I do in the article, that preventive medicine is essential for this problem. And it's going to the root of the problem to prevent the horrors of war. And one key method is refusing to pay for war. And then I also wanted to stress militarism, like most of our other big problems today, continue because we consent to them. And so the issue of consent, because of a variety of reasons, inconvenience, fear, etc., actually the consent continues the cycle of militarism funded by taxes. That's why I stop there.
Okay. And then also just wanted to highlight another resource that's going to be available is a video between Lincoln, an interview between Lincoln and a family physician, a longtime war tax resistant family physician that will also be available. And along those lines, Lincoln, you've engaged in resistance and mobilization alongside many healthcare workers over the years, including with this family physician. What is the power, in your point of view, of having healthcare workers in particular engage in tax resistance ourselves and vocally mobilizing around tax resistance?
I think there's, I think, yeah, that's a great question. And I think any act of war tax resistance, even when it's not by a healthcare worker, and even for those that might not be thinking about being war tax resistors, just knowing, like learning that someone that they know is doing this can make them, it can give pause, because anything about that kind of statement of I'm refusing to pay something to the IRS, with the ingrained fear of the IRS, I think can cause pause and reflection about why would they do this? What would make them go up against this fear that all of us all of us in the United States have ingrained into us? But I think that when healthcare workers do it, because there's um, the vocation of healing, and this notion of not doing harm, I think that can add, some credence to this, where granted, most war tax resistors I know are what I would call quote unquote normal people, the people that are, might be running just their own small business, their own shop, or they might be, working as a social worker, or, so many just regular jobs. It's not like it's most of the war tax resistors I know do not belong to, communes, or as when Republicans, well, I don't want to get on that side. I know in the state of Wisconsin, when there were some protests here, our governor of one denomination, state, well, these are just all out of state one, that's all they do. They're just, they're protesters by profession. But I didn't think that was true of the protesters at that time, but I also don't think it's true of war tax resistors. They're usually just people who, many tracks of life. But I think the healthcare profession itself adds even more pause for reflection, because it can really go along with what do we mean by leading lives that are leading towards healing and reconciliation.
And I wanted to also just highlight or stress, Howard's article. If you haven't read it, I felt it was really compelling too, just in terms of like the current moment and the current our current funding towards the Israeli military, just about his global health work and how treating refugees and migrants as his like patient population, and their specific ailments and conditions, how they were directly tied to the harms that Israel and U.S. military bodies enacted on his patient community and population. So I just think that's the history, going back to U.S. and Israeli involvement in Latin American wars and dictatorships, and the impacts on the patients that he has been serving in global health context. So I do also want to highlight another question for Howard. If this question is in the Q&A, I'd love to hear from Howard if he's lost Social Security, healthcare, or other benefits through his jobs over the years.
No, to my knowledge, I haven't. Long ago, I actually had about $500 garnished from wages, and that was after a process that took about 7 or 8 years, including an appeal through the tax court arrangement because you have several levels of appeal in the IRS. And then if they're still demanding the money, and there's still time for that they have before the 10 years elapse, you can still move the case to tax court and have a couple layers of appeals in that. So in tax court, the case eventually went to the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals. This was in New York State because they happened to cover where I was filing. And, the person I was working with was a friend in a law co-op who wrote a really great draft saying that the requirement for a certified conscientious objector to war, the requirement to pay war taxes for war, was unjust and unconstitutional. And so this went up to that court, and the IRS must have spent, I don't know, $30,000, $50,000. They sent a whole team of lawyers to about this case, and it was in the court of Judge Irving Kaufman, who was the judge who sentenced the Rosenbergs to death in the 50s. So this was some time after that. So he ruled against the claim, not with any substantive reason. And so as a result of all that process, I had $500, taken out of my income. That was when I was a resident, actually.
Can I get to a time check with Yuri of how much longer we had allotted?
Well, we'd like to ask the three of you if you all would mind staying a few more minutes to answer other questions in the Q&A. We still have quite a few questions open. Fantastic, thank you.
Also, just in terms of like, there are some questions about notes and hearing Howard. Just so you know, we will be, I guess this affects the live caption, but we're going to be sending out to all the panelists notes and maybe a version of the recording of this. So hopefully this will be accessible later too. A question that we have also is, do you think it would be helpful for us to do a mass mobilization to withhold some amount and or send letters as healthcare workers collectively with the same letter?
Well, I would respond to that by saying I would think it'd be very helpful. I think it would be unprecedented to my knowledge that an organized group of health workers would say we're all resisting war taxes. I think that would probably catch some attention if the IRS had a person available to open the letter, because they often don't because they're so backlogged. So that would be an answer just as a guess. I don't know that there would be a specific effect, but I'd be optimistic.
Yeah, I would just say I kind of mentioned this in the intro too, like, yeah, how powerful it would be, especially in this, setting where healthcare workers are supposed to have a different kind of status after COVID, and the kind of ways that our profession has been popularly associated with like being self-sacrificing and putting community health above everything else, even their own well-being, for us as healthcare workers with that kind of reputation to come together and engage in this sort of movement, I think would be very powerful, and would also help with anybody who ended up having the IRS kind of come after them, because we'd have more of a community to anchor onto that's more specific than just other people of conscience, but specifically like healthcare workers of conscience. So they're just also addressing, there's a lot of questions about potentially putting taxes into an escrow and telling the IRS that they'll pay their taxes once the US stops funding war, if that kind of changes the legality behind, would affect legality of war, engaging in war tax resistance using this method. And so I guess the idea behind having a follow-up session would be kind of to get more into nitty-gritty details, like a kind of tax clinic, if you will. I'm going to.
I could at least, since people asked that a couple times, I mean, there are people I know that do that, but it doesn't change the legality of it. It is still definitely an illegal action, and it doesn't, change any consequences or actions by the IRS. It's just some people prefer to do it that way, so it's very kind of cut and dry. It's easier to keep track of where those funds are, and yeah, but it doesn't change anything legally.
It I think does have a moral impact, in the sense, I'm not sure it would influence any particular IRS agent who reads it, but if it's publicized, I think it conveys that this isn't usually a matter of not wanting to pay taxes for good things other than war. So a lot, part of this has a symbolic effect of not consenting to war and militarism. So I just wanted to mention that as well.
Okay. I do have a question that was directed to me as a even though I'm moderating, but it was if, as a current medical student applying into family medicine residency, do I feel like my fellow residents are open to war tax resistance, if I'm able to talk about it with my colleagues and urging them to engage. So I'm not a medical student anymore. I am now a resident, and I have talked about this with other residents, and it seems like a lot of like there is a lot of interest, especially right now. There's a group of residents organizing across the country who are in communication with one another about, being a resident during this iteration of the genocide against Gaza, what it means to be in hospitals where we're made to be silent or not speak up or not promote, advocate for a ceasefire, and that looking for different avenues to engage in resistance that can extend beyond the bounds of a hospital walls. And then there had also been a question about.
Could I comment about that?
Oh, yes.
So I've actually had positive experiences talking about this with colleagues, starting in residency and continuing during the whole period. I've never talked with anybody in medicine who just dismissed this as, not reasonable or unethical or whatever. And then there's been a handful of people, and it's almost always in a conversation that's not starting about war taxes. It's like getting together for coffee or having dinner or whatever, then it comes up. And there have been some people who have decided to resist taxes starting from those encounters. I actually never kept track of how many, but it it's I know it's not zero, and it's not 20,000.
A quick note that on the poll you can check more than one option. So, and then there was two questions that I think are somewhat somehow related in terms of kind of engaging in. So okay, one of them is working as a traveler considered a way like a nurse traveler or well, yeah, nurse traveler, for example, considered a way to resist tax as most of the income is non-taxable. Most of the income is considered stipends and reimbursement for things like housing. Would that be the way to kind of avoid paying into war taxes?
I'm not familiar. Maybe I don't know if Howard can speak to that. I'm not familiar with that type of position at all, but my assumption as a layperson in that would be, is that enough to live on? Normally, what you get paid, at least when I've been reimbursed for travel types of things, it's usually, you know, covers only my basic expenses. It doesn't cover anything else. And yeah, so most of that usually is not, most or all of it's usually not taxable, but um, I would assume that even as a traveler, you must get paid something. Otherwise, it's volunteer work, right?
I think that the majority, so like as far as I understand, some of your income goes towards paying for your housing where you live and then housing where you're traveling to. And then the the hourly rate that you actually get paid for doing the work is ends up being less than the sum of that other money that then is non-taxable. So it's a bit different of a like travel reimbursement than other people get paid when they travel for work. Because people will be like when they do travel work, they'll be in a place for like 3 months on end, versus just kind of you know going somewhere for a week and then coming back. But basically, if I guess the idea is that if you're making non-taxable income, that kind of would maybe parallel with the idea of like making under the poverty line where you would end up not owing. So I guess the main thing is kind of putting you in a position where you're not owing is is a way to engage in war tax resistance. And then the question also of if you make enough like tax deductible donations, can you engage in war tax resistance that way?
I would say normally not, particularly if you're an employee. Because if you're an employee, if you're self-employed, you can take deductions for advertising. So, you could donate to have your business put in, if, the church book that's having some fundraiser or a picnic for the hospital, or, there's all sorts of things where you could kind of donate money where it's really fundraising, but it could count as an advertising expense. So, that's a way you could donate and then significantly lower your taxable income. But if you're an employee, you don't have an option for that. You just can make regular charitable donations. But those charitable donations, if you want to make use of them from a tax perspective, are on Schedule A, which means you're not going to take the standard deduction. So this is where I feel I might be getting too nitty gritty for some folks, but uh, so most people who don't take the standard deduction and file Schedule A where charitable deductions are listed, it's because they also bought a home, and it's because their interest on their home loan is also on Schedule A, which is high enough to make it surpass the standard deduction. And then to add to that, as I recall, most recently, on that form, you get about a fifth, like for every $100 you donate, it lowers your taxable income by $50. So it's not a 1-for-1. So again, if you're self-employed and you gave $100 for the picnic as an advertisement, you get $100 deduction for your $100 donation. If you're taking it on a Schedule A as an employee, you only get a 50% kind of deduction on everything you donate. So it becomes almost impossible, I would say, to lower your taxable income to the point where you could still live and not owe anything.
Well, I could add that I actually found it as a result of advice from, my accountant. By the way, I could mention that in my experience, accountants love to do this type of work. I was expecting the opposite, but I've never had a bad experience with an accountant. And my current accountant actually advised me to file that I have a small business. And so I actually did use deductions for the business in the way that you're asking about. So I think it really depends on the individual situation, and it's helpful to get advice.
And I think Howard actually has access, has shared an article that, or a resource that we can also share out that, a lot of businesses, large corporations have many methods that they use to decrease their tax burden and not, to decrease their tax burden. And I think that it's important for us to understand that we also have access to those methods, and should use them. There's no reason why billion-dollar companies should be able to have less of a tax burden than the average, healthcare worker, for example.
Let me just add to that.
Yeah.
One of my accountants actually said at one point, you could withhold more from the IRS for this purpose if you just filed in the usual way and used the legal loopholes that are available. And, which is interesting. It's related to why a large number of our major corporations pay no taxes or a very small percentage of taxes relative to earnings. So it's an interesting thing to think about. I've never gone that direction because I wanted to make a statement and at least hopefully be honest and maybe of some influence.
I will also, there's a couple questions just about like the logistics of war tax resisting in the Q&A. Essentially, if you have any money that you owe to taxes to the IRS, you can resist. So one of the ways to put yourself in a position where you owe rather than have had your employer or the IRS withhold is by filing dependents or exemptions that allow you to not have tax withholding. If you have had taxes already withheld and then you go through the tax process preparing for filing and you notice that there's actually more money that you owe to the IRS versus money that you would get in a refund, that money that you owe to the IRS, you can resist. You can't resist once the IRS has withheld money from you. So for people in the current tax season that during the fiscal year of 2023 did not claim exempt or claim dependents that allowed them to avoid having taxes withheld, that money has been, like, we'll sometimes call it like seized already, and is not available to be to resist.
So yeah, I'll just add on that'd be W4 resistance, and this is where I can tell that Rico has a longer history as a war tax resistor, because they totally revamped the W-4 in 2020. So again, you want to take more deductions. Under the old system, you'd put in a number that could represent dependents and or health expenses or a lot of different things. You'd put in a number like 5 or 6, but now it's you don't put dependents, you don't put any of that. So just to be clear, there's a line 4B. And again, if you go to our website, nutric.org/W-4, or just Google Nutric and W-4, we explain how you can inflate your W-4 if you want to, so that you have the choice to pay at the end of the year, or at least file a correct one so that you're not giving the IRS a free loan.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I just want to say that I have used the W-4 method to deal with the problem of withholding, and that's been like throughout my career. So I would recommend for those of you who are salaried, if you decide to do some more tax resistance, that you do look into the W-4 process.
Also to mention, you should definitely keep track of where you are redirecting your taxes to. I think that that's often something that people will include in the letter. Like, I owed this much money, and this is where I directed that money, whether it was to a local public school or, public social services, to kind of demonstrate that you're still engaging in the principles of taxes, but you can, in good conscience, have your income or your earnings go towards funding military and causing harm. Is there any question?
Nutrix has a bunch of very helpful letters that previous people have sent that can be used to model that if a person's interested.
I see there's a note from some of our other organizers of the session to maybe do maybe a little lightning round through the technical questions, which I'd be happy to. So there's a question. I work for someone who sent a 1099 to the IRS and to me. How do I calculate how much I should pay to Social Security and how much to Medicare? So if you're an employee, your employer pays half of that. If you get a 1099, that's because you're self-employed and you're responsible for both portions. So that's 15.3% of all of your earnings are combined. The 15.3% covers both Social Security and Medicare. If you actually look at your tax forms when they're filled out, you'll see where that amount is listed in the self-employment section of the 1040. Does the IRS keep track of any letters or acts of protest and report it back in any way? They will keep, if you send it in with your paper, either with a partial or full payment or with your paper return, it'll be included in your file. But otherwise, it's not necessarily reported back in any way. They're just told, put it in your file, move along. So
I had a funny reaction the last letter I wrote. The IRS wrote back, the usual letter about what I owe, and specifically said, for the other things you raised in the letter, we don't understand it. We can't process it. So at least they read it, and I never heard anything more about it.
So someone also asked if I go to H&R Block and I don't understand the forms, which most of us don't. How do I file my taxes there and resist paying what I owe? So again, one of the options anytime someone's filing online is you can have it marked down that you'll pay and send a check separately. So you can just tell H&R Block, I'm going to send a check separately, and they should be able to give you like the paperwork to do that. And then you could either just send in a letter at that point or send in nothing. But essentially, you'd let them know, like, I don't want to pay electronically.
Can you, Lincoln, there's a bunch of kind of clarifications around the terminology of decreasing tax burden versus war tax resistance. I think that's actually important and an error on my part. If you don't mind helping clarify that language, but yeah, I think the distinction between decreasing a tax burden versus engaging in war tax resistance is a really important one.
Yeah, so yeah, definitely. So for some folks, I mean, they can go hand in hand, but they're not always the same thing. There are folks like we have a number of booklets on our website, and one of them is on simple living, and it's our most downloaded booklet. And so that might be something where you see folks who are purposefully lowering their tax burden to the point of owing little or nothing. But it usually also goes along with the philosophy of having a smaller carbon footprint, so it brings together a number of their values. But again, decreasing the tax burden may or may not be an option, or may not be something that someone's interested in who's also practicing war tax resistance. So again, they can go together, but they can also be exclusive.
Yeah, and just war tax resistance includes like at least filing. So in the action of filing, or doesn't include at least filing, but one of like the main ways of engaging war tax resistance is in the process of any kind of filing, including some kind of communication and letter about, about resistance to taxes and war tax. Okay, I closed the Q&A. Maybe Lincoln, if there's anything else that you wanted to lightning round on, I can try and clean it up while you're doing that.
Sure, good. I know someone asked a question about the counselors. Maybe I'll just put that link back there, or I'm unclear if their question was maybe they're in a state where there are not counselors. Maybe that's what they meant to say. I'm not sure. But if you're in a state where there's not a counselor on that link, feel free to contact someone in a different state. It's fine. The people there, again, they're just happy to touch base with anyone and help them figure things out in their own situation.
Could I say that one of the questions maybe I could comment on, does war tax resistance generate a criminal record? And this is something that I've been interested because of medical licenses. When you apply for a medical license or even hospital privileges or whatever, that's a standard question. They do a background check to verify that you don't have a criminal record. And you can still get a license and get on hospital privileges with a criminal record, but it's a hassle. And I decided to not do that. And it enlightened me that even if I follow the resistance through all of the appeals levels and all of the tax court levels, and they garnish my wages, that isn't illegal in the sense of generating a criminal record. So some of the fear about criminal record actually is not accurate based on the fact that it doesn't actually lead to a criminal charge, to my knowledge. At least that's what I and a few others have found.
Yeah, so there are two divisions. You could say generally there's two divisions to the IRS. There's what we call a civil division, and they're working on collection. If you receive a bank levy, a wage garnishment, any of those, even a house seizure, that's all with the civil arm. They have a specific arm that actually deals with criminal prosecution, and that's totally different. So if you received a summons, that could be from the criminal division. Again, when it comes to the criminal division getting involved with war tax resistors, it really, in the last 25 plus years, except for that instance with the lawyer activist in the Bay Area, it's been only people who have falsified their tax forms, their 1040 forms that they file, and like either understate their income, take deductions that they shouldn't take. That's why we would in most situations, recommend people fill out accurate tax forms if they're going to file. Doing that seems to be a way to at least avoid criminal conviction, because as Howard pointed out, a criminal that being criminally prosecuted and convicted could lead to someone losing their license. It depends on the state. But just the collection process is civil, and it does not put anything on one's criminal record. It is not a criminal act. It's not criminal prosecution by the IRS. It's totally different.
Okay. Howard, anything else you want to tackle, or looking to wrap it up and respect people's time? But there's still some good questions. There's an infinite amount of good questions. So
Well,
are you good, Lincoln?
one of the preparing questions that you ask are there sister strategies to war tax resistance that healthcare workers can also use to divest and defund genocide and oppression? And so, I would just answer to that resistance is an important part, but not the only part of moving beyond our very injurious global political economic system of racial capitalism to an economy based on solidarity, mutual aid, and sustainability. So based on that, I do a lot of work with the solidarity economy and mutual aid, and I use essentially all of the money I don't pay as war tax to support local efforts in developing housing, food, and so forth. So that's another thing to consider, because war tax resistance actually can have a broader effect than just the act of resisting.
All right. Sounds good. We are going to end the session here. We thank you all for participating and attending, and are just very thankful for even engaging in this conversation and thinking critically about where our money's going and what we're inherently funding when we don't question